So, Dr. Rudy, I understand your work on indigenous knowledge systems to be a long time of dedication and research. And when you proposed the Tweezer cult to me, it was met with immediate confusion, but also interest in how strange it sounds. So my first question is, what people are you actually referring to, and what time period are we talking about?
Oh, good. Well, let's start first with the very idea of a tweezer, so that you're not confused. Tweezers, historically, in the Western Hemisphere, before Columbus, were used by men, and they were hung from their neck on a leather string, and they would sit in a place and pull out their whiskers with their tweezers. So it was a way of slowly preening, taking care of yourself, doing hygiene, if you will, and eliminating hairs that are sticking out of your face. Well, where was it most commonly done? It was done in the jungles of what we now call Ecuador. And pre-Columbian, it of course wasn't called Ecuador. It was actually part of the northern part of the Inca Empire. And about 1529, a Spanish artist, a pencil drawer, drew the picture of a boat, a sailboat, which was actually kind of a raft with a sail on it, out on the coast of the Banderas, the Bay of Banderas, right out here near Puerto Vallarta. But in 1529, and he drew this thing without knowing that he was actually looking at a boat that had come all the way from what we now call Ecuador. Well, years ago, I was studying the Purépecha in Michoacán and their land use and food production activities in the face of significant climate changes. And years ago, what we would call climate changes were caused by things like volcanoes. And the Purépecha were faced with occasional volcanic explosions that changed the atmosphere. And so I was interested in knowing what it was they were doing to accommodate these changes and still produce food. And exploring that as I did, I came upon a question that was raised, and that is why certain words were used among the Purépecha that weren't their words, but words from the Incas, who were more than 3,500 miles away. And of course, we all know that people didn't have motor vehicles to do all the transport, and we know that language is a product of interaction. So I began to dig into the two questions. One, a boat off of Bay of Banderas in 1529, and what is it doing there, and what the heck was it made of? And the other question was, what it was about the Purépecha that got them to speaking a language that included words from the Incas, in other words, Quechua. Well, I checked with anthropologists and archaeologists all over the place, and none of them had much of an answer. They mainly thought that it was just a coincidence, really, that they must have had some kind of contact, but nobody, they would say, actually knows about how that worked. Well, you could say this was a sideline on food and Purépecha, and I would agree. But when I do research, I find all sorts of little talons that head off in different directions, and sometimes they make a loop and come back from whence I came. So in the course of going out in the loop, I discover new things that actually relate back to what I was looking at in the first place. So I thought I would go ahead and take a look at this. Well, when I began to develop this question, I wanted to know what the boat was made of. And I looked at the picture very carefully, and it was logs, very large logs. And I had read that this was a boat made from balsa wood. I thought, well, where do you get balsa wood? Not in Mexico. Not in Central America. Well, then where do you get it? Turns out there's a whole forest in what used to be, or before, what was called, or what we now call Ecuador. I thought, oh, so that boat had to have come from that area in northern part of what we now call South America. And I said, what's it doing off the coast of the Bay of Banderas? So I began to look into that question more deeply. So I investigated what was going on with a bunch of boats that had been coming up the coast. And they, turns out, were going to a place off the coast of Colima, the state of Colima now here in Mexico. And they were sending people into the water, diving, for oysters. I thought, interesting. So I investigated that more, and it turns out that you could put 40 tons, metric tons, of oysters on one of these balsa wood boats. Wow, a lot of oysters. Somebody likes oysters. Turns out that when you followed one of those boats back, because they did go back every 6 months, because I then investigated the currents on the Pacific coast, every 6 months they switch, so you can actually use them to head south, and then you can use them to go north. So you have to be someplace for 6 months. And that's approximately what the time was that apparently people spent off the coast of Colima collecting oysters. Turns out that they took those oysters that were pink spondylus oysters, and it's a very specific oyster. Yes, there are spondylus oysters up and down the coast, but the pink ones were off of Colima. And so I asked myself, why would anybody care about spondylus oysters that were pink? Obviously, by the time they got back to Inca country, they will not have been able to eat those oysters because they would probably be dead and spoiled. So they must want the shells. So it turned out that's exactly what they wanted. They took the shells back, and so I looked into Inca history. And it turns out that the Inca, who was like the head dude, was carried on a large, whatever it's called, by 3 or 4 or 6 people, walking down the Inca roads. In front of that carriage, people would spread out crushed spondylus oyster shell. So they had a pink road for the Inca to walk down. Wow, I thought, that's a lot of effort just to get a little cover for the road. But it turned out, as I investigated further, the spondylus oyster thing, having required that people stay somewhere for 6 months, meant they had to get off the raft, which meant they went ashore. So then I asked myself, well, where did they go ashore? And the closer I looked, I discovered they went off initially in the Balsas River area, which is in the southern part, coastal Michoacan nowadays, in Mexico. And I thought, well, why would they do that? Well, I then went back to look at the Incas. And they were very interested in metallurgy. What were they mostly interested in? Mining of silver, mining of copper, And what did they make? Well, they made all sorts of things. They made earrings. They made dangling things from people's necks. They made pots. They made plates. All that kind of stuff. And so then I asked, well, why would they go off on the Balsa River? Because it was right next to a mountain that was full of silver. And they expressed a deep and abiding interest in taking that silver, and it turns out some of the copper as well. And so not only did they get oysters, they managed to pick up some additional material. So then I asked the question, who might they have met there at the river mouth of the Balsa River? And after some investigation, I learned that the Wakasacha people lived there. And the Wakasacha, what's the significance of Wakasacha? They were willing to look into extracting the silver and the copper as well. They'd never done that sort of thing before. So they became workers for the people because they needed to have more than just the people on the boat. They had other people there too. Then I began to ask the question, well, what happens when two people who don't speak the same language but depend on one another end up doing? They trade words, oddly enough. But that led me nowhere until I began to learn that the Wakasacha took about 100 years and went up the Balsa River into the interior, ending up in an area that we know as the Lake of Pátzcuaro. Well, all right, you say that's interesting. So you've got Wakasacha, now they've gone up the river, and now they're at Lake Pátzcuaro. What happened there? Well, all the volcanic stuff that I'd mentioned before managed to influence the movements of the people who, Spaniards, borrowing a word from the Mexica, Chichimex, or Chicamatl, they took those people. They would move around because, of course, when things blew up, they didn't want to get covered on all that stuff, and so some of them ended up close down to Pátzcuaro. Well, they came together at that point on a little island in the lake. The Wakasacha ended up on that little island, and so did some group from we're right next to the airport. Some of the people who came from the Chichimex. And actually, if I look at my notes, it was probably the Guameras or some of the Atome who were there. But in any case, what was important about them is that they were moon worshippers. What is interesting about the Wakasacha in those terms? Sun worshippers.
Interesting.
Okay? Now, they're both sitting on the island. They've been there for a little while, and they get to know each other. Turns out, that's what made Purepecha, the combination of those two people. And so I ended up with an interesting answer to the question how Purepecha ended up with Quechua. Because of the metallurgical influence from Inca country coming by way of a balsa raft at the river Rio Balsa, and the people moving up the river into Pátzcuaro, meeting people who came down from the north, the moon people and the sun people. Now, it's important one remember the moon and the sun identities. Because moon, in this case, was feminine, and the sun was masculine, okay? Which created a kind of balance among the Purepecha, and their own story was about maintaining and ensuring the balance. Well, now I am actually back out on the coast, and I'm thinking, okay, I've sort of explained why Quechua words are in the language Purepecha because of metallurgy and all that stuff. But then I asked, what about some of the archaeologists who dug up some graves in the western part of Mexico, and out of those graves they pulled a strange object, a tweezer that looked like any tweezer. In fact, it looked like the tweezers that would come from Ecuador. And I thought, well, now isn't that interesting? So whoever went in there must have been using that tweezer probably for the same purpose that the people who had tweezers elsewhere would use it, and that is to pluck hairs out of their face. Well, I looked closer, and I asked the question, what would people want to do if they had these things hanging around their neck? And that turned us to the sun and the moon. If you combine silver and copper, you end up with something like bronze. Mm-hmm. And what happens when you do that and you're walking around outside? The sun reflects off of it, and it means the person who, or could mean, the person who's wearing it actually has the sun hanging from their neck.
Very interesting.
Huh? So what do? Well, you say, it's interesting that you can pluck hair out of your face, but it's more important that it is a reflection of the sun. And whoever has the sun around their neck has a higher status because they're sun people. So the tweezer slowly evolved into a flat, wide piece of metal hanging from a talon on the neck.
Interesting.
And you can see that if you look at monos, you'll see, and you look at pictographs, you'll see that some people have that. Well, that's because they're higher status, and basically some people, they have the sun around their neck. What do you think of that?
That's incredible. That's incredible. Can you see a relationship between the tweezer, the form of the tweezer actually changing from kind of just, a skinny tweezer that you could associate more easily with plucking hairs, and then it transforming into these more elaborate forms that are curved, and some are even spiraling and are more elaborate? Can you see that transition of the form of them with, I guess, a transition from using different kinds of metals as well, including the bronze, as you mentioned, which makes it, I'm assuming, makes the metal stronger. You can do more with it.
Excellent question, because ultimately you're led to ask the question about why that shape slowly evolved into a really kind of a big clam-like shape, and some of them were like 6 to 8 inches in diameter, all the more to reflect the sun, of course. And then some of them are shaped kind of like triangular wedges. And so then you have to ask the question, where might that come from? And I did. And there's a thing called, both in northern Inca country and now in western Mexico, axe money. In other words, that's a term that archaeologists called it because what they found in some of these graves was metal pieces that were shaped like axes, right? That coincidentally had a shape similar to some of these tweezers that people had hanging around their neck. So I take the view that axe money that had evolved value introduced from the south now has yet another value in the form of the tweezer. And the shape of the tweezer then takes more, at least some of its influence, from the axe money itself as a reflection of yet another form of value.
Wow. Well, I think that answers one of my questions as well, because in Western Mexico, through the archaeological excavations, I had noted initially that, tweezers were one of the strange objects that they found, but they also found an abundance of bells and fish hooks and awls and other little objects. So I was really wondering, why it was the tweezers specifically that was the one that became so important and had this symbolic use. But I guess it comes from its initial use as just being worn around the neck for practicality. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. And, it took a little time for that to evolve. But what's interesting to me is that over that time, maybe 100 years, because we're looking at about 800 AD to 1500 AD, all right? And the most of this activity is going on between 800 and 950. So roughly over 150 years, there is plenty of time for the evolved use of the tweezer and its evolved change away from plucking hairs to becoming a stylish and a representational symbol for power because of its reflective capability. Now, let's assume you've got 2 generations of people who now have evolved a bigger and bigger version, because of course the more metal you had, the bigger version you had. But you're traveling now. And it turns out that among the Mihi and the Zapotec down in the south central part of Mexico, suddenly you begin to see these things hanging around people's necks. Trade. Or simply war. Somebody got the dickens beat out of them and somebody took that from them and wore it around their neck. But what did they think it was? Well, it was a symbol for success. And so the whole thing goes all the way over to the Yucatec and the Yucatan, to the point where you now see generations of change between the populations, but uses for this tweezer. And that's why I called it the tweezer cult.
Very interesting. In my own research in the material culture of this region, I've been looking at a lot of the ceramics that have been dug up in Western Mexico, and I've come across some effigies that have shells around their necks as well, conch shells, and that was also a symbol of power and also pointed to trade that would be happening. Mm-hmm. Does the shell hold a similar type of significance?
It's the pre-metallic symbol.
Okay.
And one of the qualities about it, and this goes to some of the cosmology of the region, is the spiral nature of the conch. Mm-hmm. If you look inside, it's spirals. And in an earlier study I did on indigenous knowledge in the Western Hemisphere, I came up with a whole series of metaphors for ways of thinking. Progressivism, for example, which isn't the political version of it, but progressivism is like symbolized by a line that starts at one point and it goes straight, slightly up at a 45-degree angle. And the presumption is that at the bottom part of that line you have the past or primitive form, and at the top part you have the progressive or more advanced version, and thus you have what is the common conception in all over the world now, and that is everything goes from less good to the good. Okay? But then I asked the question, who else had thoughts about how they considered the world and evaluated truth, and how one might symbolize those forms? And I looked at providentialism in Europe. Providentialism is nothing more or less than the assumption that God is predetermining virtually everything. And so your life is predetermined. So if you begin as a slave, you are always a slave. There's no way to get out of it. If you're wealthy, you're always wealthy. So Providence assures that structure of society. So you had that in certain parts of Europe. But then you head down into a place we would call Nubian, northern part of the Nile, and ask, well, what's that all about? Well, it turns out you could look at that and you can come up with a kind of fatalism, which is to say, kind of triangular. Everything is enclosed and leads to essentially the same thing. It's always going to be fatalistic, which is not much different than Confucianism in China. Okay? And I thought, golly, those are different ways of imagining, ways of explaining reality. How would you characterize, I asked myself, the way people would think, say, the Purepecha would think, or the Huacasecha, or even the Iroquois, or the Quechua? Yeah. And what I found was, in the Yucatec, a whole conception based on their understanding of the galaxy. And that is, it's a gigantic spiral. And I thought, explain, because that's how their calendar came together. It was based on the length of time it takes for the Earth system to spiral all the way around the galaxy, and that's about 25,000 years. How they knew that isn't clear to me, frankly. There's a calculation, you can come up with it. Somebody must have sat down and worked it out. But in any case, their whole calendric system was based on that notion. And I thought, well, if it's a spiral, how would one symbolize that? And I remembered a trip I had taken to Australia among the Aboriginals there, and one of my colleagues there said, how would you like to taste native Alchiringa, which is what they call Australia, food? I said, sure. And he bent down and he plucked out of the ground of a coconut tree a grub about the size of my thumb. And of course it squirmed and all that, right? And he said, here, take a bite of that. Well, I thought, no, I don't want to do that. But I couldn't say no because I was a guest. So I did. And what was inside? Coconut milk. It was really good.
Wow.
I thought, what a surprise and a gift. But then I looked at that grub, and you notice, if you look carefully at it, at one end, it's very tiny, and at the other end, it's very tiny. But as it gets bigger, it reaches a maximum size, and then it gets smaller again. And it is a spiral, going from the small to large, and then down to small again, right? So I thought, that must be a way to think about the way people think in the Western Hemisphere. Spiralism is what I called it. Well, I found a good deal of support for that when the question of memory came up. That is, how does anything get remembered? And the explanation that comes from, frankly, some of the pictographs is that memory is really little pieces, patched thoughts that are stuck to the spiral. And so there are gaps between them. And when you want to remember something, you search through the spiral and you find one of those little patches of thought. So memory is connected to this spiral. And the way to describe the spiral is that thought goes in all directions simultaneously. Okay?
Yes.
And I thought, what a nice way to explain how people think here, which helps one then understand how this whole hemisphere evolved over time. And I ended up calling it a knowledge system, the Anáhuac knowledge system. And where does that come from? Anáhuac is the word that Mexica and others, even the Yucatec, called all this land. It means land surrounded by water. So the whole hemisphere, I decided, is really Anáhuac Chem, CEM, which is all of the land. And so then the question was, how do you understand the relationship between those local ideas and the fact you can find similar ideas in different parts of the hemisphere pre-Columbian? Well, that's where balsa wood boats come into play. If you look at this little map I have been using to illustrate, the yellow area on the western part of South America and Central America and up into Mexico is about 3,400 miles that balsa wood boats can travel. Okay? And they do end up right over here off of the coast of Colima and off of the Balsas River is here. But if you look on the other side of the hemisphere, you can see this green line around Brazil, because I was trying to answer the question where pineapple comes from.
Yes.
That's where it comes from. It comes from the jungles of what we call Brazil. And it ended up in Yucatan and in Tabasco. And then it got traded around. All right? But then I asked the question, well, how is it that corn, as I mentioned you once before, how did it get among the Iroquois and the Senecas? And they are proud to say that they plant corn and squash and beans, and they do it in a way, as it turns out, exactly the way the Purepecha do in Mexico and they do in Yucatan. And I thought, well, they had a pretty good email system, or somebody was doing some traveling. And it turns out, along the coast of what we call eastern Mexico, there's a huge amount of transport going on using another form of currency, and you'll love this one because I like it, chocolate beans, which was the currency of the day. And why would they use that? Because when you drank that, you could see things in the universe that were now suddenly available to you that weren't otherwise visible, because your eyes actually would dilate a little bit and you could see. But more importantly, because Yucatan, which is right there on the map, had people moving, they went up the Mississippi River and the Missouri River, and right there is the Iroquois Confederacy. And all of these people raised corn all in this area. They did all up and down the Mississippi, also raised corn. Where did they get the corn? Yucatan.
All made possible by the balsa wood boat.
Yeah. And so then you look over here in what we now call Georgia, and you can still find pyramids that are resembling those in west or eastern Mexico. How did they get there? Somebody sent them probably by email. So I guess the message is that the whole hemisphere is vibrating well before any of the Europeans arrived.
Yes.
People are traveling, trading, engaging, doing metallurgy, moving food, moving lumber, moving skins, furs, all kinds of things are happening. And it's one of the things that centers Mexico as the actual place that causes all this to happen. It's the largest civilization, even more so than the Incas. And it is at that point that it occurred to me that Anáhuac clearly is the whole of the hemisphere, but the center of the hemisphere is in Mexico.
That's fascinating. Wow. And I think it really speaks to the importance then of the importance of West Mexico and the importance of continuing to do research in that region and thinking about all these connections and thoughts that go out, as you said, in so many different ways. If we can return to the spiral and this idea of this cosmic idea of the spiral and the symbolism of that shape, and relating it back to the tweezers again themselves, this idea just seems so much more grand than I had initially thought. I'm curious now, who were the people then who, specifically in society, that had the privilege of wearing these elaborate tweezers now? Because it doesn't seem like it would be a privilege for the everyday man. Is that correct?
Yeah. I would say it ultimately fell to the sun worshippers.
Okay.
Those who understood that as the prime influence in the region's life. And they saw that as the source of all life. Without the sun, there was no life.
Yes.
Okay? And so anyone who represented that perspective then had a leg up really on everybody else because they had access to life. And of course, once they ended up wearing the symbol in the form of the reflective tweezer, then it was pretty darn clear who had access to the sun because they had it on them.
Wow.
So the Wakasecha, I think, are, for that reason, very important, but you look around and ask the question, who else were sun worshippers?
Yes.
And it turns out that anyone or any group of people, and let's be clear, we tend to think in terms of tribes because of the Romans who created this notion that there were people who lived in Rome and they were the civilized people, and everybody outside, they were tribes. That meant they were primitive. The problem with that is that it divided the world up in a totally unrealistic way, as we might now imagine, but it also caused people in Britain eventually, who were occupied by the Romans, to use this terminology to keep dividing the world as if there are discrete groups. Now, I use the Six Nations or the Iroquois Confederacy. I've used Wakasecha. I've used Purepecha. I could use Cora. I could use Huascarini. I could use any number of names. But most of those are conventional terms that have been given to us by anthropologists, and they actually mislead us because the relationship between different peoples actually is pretty fluid. It wasn't like everybody lived in one building and couldn't get out. No, people were actually moving around quite a bit, as my map suggests, and that caused them to come into contact with each other, not just in terms of shell or axe money or chocolate beads or beans, but in terms of trade and social intercourse as well. So you ended up extending definitions of who you were into other communities or other places.
Absolutely.
All right? And so it's an interesting thing to me that we now want to maintain these little divisions, like we have 194 states in the world, right? As if there are real differences between them. There aren't, but as if there are. So then we could say there are 5,000 indigenous communities and say they're different. Well, yeah, but not really. The fact is, all of them are related in one way or another. All the human beings are related in one way or another. And there are systems that different nations or communities or peoples actually invented that are supra-definitions. One of which, actually I have, and I think you might even be a part of it, when you hear people say, I'm connected to a particular animal, right? And they're very proud of that. What the heck does that mean? Well, if you look at the Wakasecha, as it turns out, and you look at even some of the Quechua in the northern part of old Inca territory, you come to realize that they define their relationship to one another in terms of their relationship to animals. Wow. And among some people in the north, the terminology that's used is Nindudum. And what Nindudum means is you have a family connection to all of the people who are Bear, for example. And there are Bear all over the world. Mm-hmm. And you're all a part of that family. All right? Yes, you were born here in this physical location, but your Bear relationship is the supra definition of who you are. Okay? Or you could be a deer person, or an eagle person, or a clam person, any number of things. Where do these animal connections come from? They come from origin stories that explain how reality came into being. Who were the first beings? For many people, it was these animals. So if you have an animal tie, you're connected to the original, the very beginning of time. Wow. This is different than genetics.
Oh, yes.
So if you think in those terms, you can, as a friend of mine did, well, I did as well, went among the Sami in northern Scandinavia. And we're talking about, what's your family? And one said, I'm Bear among my family. Well, I happen to be Bear as well. We're related. We were related more than if we were genetically tied. Okay? Turns out I met another one in Peru who was also Bear, and another person in Pueblo who was also Bear, and a person from Western Africa who was also a Bear. I thought, that's amazing. I have family everywhere.
Wow, and that you found these networks of systems of thinking to be persistent even today.
Yeah. And then I learned, you wanted to go to the spiral thing. That is one symbol of a way of thinking, but it ties to another thing called the four directions that establishes the relationship between all things. It's just another metaphor. And if you think about it, the Christians thought they saw Jesus Christ when they saw all these different peoples with this cross thing. But that isn't what it was at all. What they were describing was a metaphorical relationship between all animals, all plants, all parts of the earth, the cosmos, all of the people, all of that in this one symbol.
Yes.
Right? And what it would do is tie the east and west and north and south, but also the up and the down. Mm-hmm. So the consequence of all of that is that there is a whole system of thought built around the four directions that at the center we call the fourth world knowledge system, which actually is global because you find the same symbols in Africa, in Europe, Asia, the Western Hemisphere, and you say, wow, all before the internet, how did that happen?
Thank you so much for your time and insight, Dr. Rudy. You have given us so much to think about in regards to the Tweezer cult and the ways ancient peoples have communicated and traveled and influenced one another. Thank you again for sharing your expertise.